Oh, welcome back. Guess what? We are here today for the Knight's Tale. All right, but before we get back in there, go ahead to slide two and turn that little highlighter on to green for me, please. What do the Canterbury Tales reveal? Put a dot by reveal. About identity, put a little dot by identity, and storytelling. Well, now we've had a chance to read it a little bit. Who have we met? Who haven't we met? Well, we've definitely met the knight whose story we're going to read today. We know that they'll be telling a few different tales in a little contest. So I'm going to put a little dot by tales over there. And I've learned a few other things. But before we move on, I want you to take a moment and highlight what else we've learned or talked about with this. So go ahead. Nice work. So we're going to go all the way to slide 12. And we're going to use the question mark to follow along because questions are our best way into a text, especially if it's tough. So, if you remember from slide 11, the knight cleared his throat, looked around him with a plea for patience, and began, the first unwilling entrant in our competition, right? This is the knight, and he's about to tell his story. So, this is the knight's tale, chivalry and rivalry. All right, let's get into it. Ooh.
The Knight's Tale: Chivalry and Rivalry. Between the smoking walls of Thebes, 2,000 men grappled, sword to sword and hand to hand. The battle between the forces of King Creon and the troops of Duke Theseus was long, fierce, and bloody. And when it was over, when Creon's army had been put to flight, the ground was carpeted with fallen knights. Athenian soldiers, searching the battlefield for their own wounded companions, found two young knights lying side by side. But as they stepped across the two bodies, one stirred, groaned, and opened his eyes. "Arcite, cousin, where are you?" he whispered. His companion was not dead either. Both were carried as prisoners to the tent of Duke Theseus. "Take them to Athens and lock them in the prison tower of my palace," said the Duke. Despite the cold stones and hard floor of their tower-top prison, both Arcite and his cousin Palamon gradually recovered from their wounds. Their devoted friendship made the passing days, weeks, and months bearable, though both grew dreadfully bored. The narrow arrow slit, which let in the only sunlight they ever saw, overlooked the Duke's garden. Each day they would take it in turns to balance on a stool and gaze down at the flowers, and at the gardener pruning the rose trees. One day there was a new visitor to the garden. Palamon was balancing on the stool at the time, and his feet slipped and almost tipped it over. "Oh, Arcite!" he exclaimed. "I never realized until this moment why I was born. Now I've seen her. She is the reason. Zeus! She can't be flesh and blood. She must be an angel." "Come down, it's my turn for the stool," said Arcite, and he took Palamon's place. Down in the garden, Duke Theseus's young sister-in-law, Emily, had come to gather flowers in a wicker basket. She sang as she picked them, and the flowers seemed to turn up their faces towards her and to faint at the touch of her hand. "Oh, lady, I'll wear your favor until the day I die," said Arcite breathlessly to himself. Palamon pulled the stool away, and they both fell in a heap to the floor. "What? Are you making fun of me, Arcite? It's serious. I'm in love with her." "You? You didn't even think she was human. It's I who love her." "You Judas! You cuckoo! Where are your vows of lifelong friendship now? The first chance you get, you stab me in the back. You viper! You thieving magpie!" This undignified scene was interrupted by the gaoler bringing in their one frugal meal of the day. "What's this, puppies?" he said, setting down the tray. "Is this cell getting too small for the two of you? Well, I've got news for whichever one of you is Sir Arcite. Sir Arcite has a friend in Athens, it would appear, and this friend has spoken to Duke Theseus and won your freedom. You can leave tomorrow."
Briefly, drag your light bulb over to the antonym undignified. Undignified is different from the word chivalry or chivalrous, which is the code of honor. So this dishonorable scene, this undignified scene, right, goes with that word. So that's an important idea today. It's an important concept. So I'm going to have you put the light bulb there. Everybody, please be on slide 14. Let's get it.
Arcite stared. Palamon got to his feet. Cousin, he said, in all our lives we have never been parted. Is there no message for me, Goler? Has no one asked for my freedom? No, you stay, and you, Sir Arcite, must be out of this land by sunset tomorrow. On pain of death are you forbidden to return. Leave the country? Leave Athens? But I don't want to go, protested Arcite. You go instead of me, Palamon. If I'm banished from Athens, I'll never see her again. Perhaps he saw, or perhaps he imagined a smile playing on Palamon's lips. Anyway, the two cousins, who all life long had been inseparable, barely spoke during that last night in the tower. Next week, Palamon was still a captive, balancing all day on the stool to watch for Emily. Far away, his cousin sat in his own house, the windows and doors all shut as if it were a prison, for he was pining for Emily. Which do you think was better off? Mused the knight, thoughtlessly interrupting his own story. Was it the man in prison, or the man in exile? Lord love you, have you no spark of wit? Demanded the lady I recognized from the night before by the enormous size of her hat. If the boy in exile had one half a brain, he'd disguise himself and go back to Athens. If all he can do is sit around and mope, he doesn't deserve the woman. Well, well, said the knight, rather taken aback by the strength of her feelings. That's just what happened. Our
Notice the connection here. The person telling the story interrupts his story and talks with one of the fellow travelers, right? So you want to make sure that you take a moment to mark the night here and then to mark the end of that little interruption there. Then it gets back to the story here. Arcite grew a beard at the bottom of page 8 on the slide. Or page 4, slide 14, page 8.
Arcite grew a beard, dressed as an Athenian, and took work as a servant in the very house where Emily lived. The thought of seeing her again quite outweighed the threat of death if he was discovered inside Athens. Every day he saw her. Every day he took orders from her lips. Every day he was able to reach out and touch the chair where she had sat, the glass from which she had drunk. He thought he would be happy forever. He was happy for just a week. Then the questions began to creep into his mind. What good is this? How is this better than being in prison? How can a servant speak of love to the sister-in-law of Duke Theseus? So he fell to brooding, to chewing his pillow at night, and cursing the hour he was born. Just 2 hours after Goler forgot to lock the door of the prison tower, Palamon found himself free, creeping through the Athenian woods, his heart in his mouth, his life in the balance. Now's my only chance, he thought. I'll find the Lady Emily and ravish her away to my own country. A rustling of leaves sent him bolting like a rabbit into the bole of a hollow tree. He squatted down low, despising his thumping heart and despising his fate for bringing an honorable knight to such a pass. The approaching footsteps halted beside the tree, and Palamon held his breath. Surely the Duke's men were not searching for him yet. Peeping through a knothole, he could see a man sitting dejectedly among the spreading roots, throwing pebbles at his own boots. What's the use, he was muttering. I might just as well be rotting in prison with Palamon. You asp! You wolf in sheep's clothing! Palamon flung himself out of the tree and grabbed Arcite by his beard. What are you doing? Sneaking back here to prowl around my Emily? Don't you talk about my mistress and lady like that, you convict, you escaped prisoner. I'm an honorable knight, Palamon maintained, despite the hammer blows Arcite was raining on his head. I love Emily far more than you do. Heart's blood, death's too good for you, you traitor to all things honorable. Goat, skunk, rat. As they pranced, grunting through the trees, their arms locked fast round one another, a wolfhound came barking round their legs excitedly. Then there was another, and another, and another, until the clearing was awash with dogs. Into the melee burst a hunting party on horseback, and at its head Duke Theseus himself. Part those men and bring them here. One of them is Emily's serving man. The other looks like one of Creon's men. He is. He's an escaped convict, Arcite shouted. And he's Arcite, banished on pain of death, called Palamon. You see, cousin, I can play as dirty as you. Theseus laughed in disbelief. Is this the devoted twosome we took prisoner at Thebes? Bosom friends never to be parted? In the name of all that's friendly, what's this quarrel about? Arcite and Palamon wiped their muddy faces and rubbed their bruised eyes. Then both together they said, Her! Emily had come riding into the clearing on a white mare. She wore a blue mantle, and even the hounds fell back whimpering at the sight of her. Arcite sprang to one stirrup, Palamon to the other. Lady, your eye has scorched me like a burning glass. Emily, your name is a millstone crushing my heart. Sweetheart, if I were to live 200... Enough, roared Theseus. What is this competition of compliments? If you're going to compete, at least do it the man's way. Tomorrow I'm holding a joust. Both your lives are forfeit, but I shall spare the man who remains alive when the joust ends. Prepare yourselves, for tomorrow you fight in the lists. Not until sundown, when they were billeted in separate tents on the field of combat, did Palamon and Arcite stop quarreling. Outside Arcite's tent, an armorer was sharpening a sword with a stone. It grated and screeched. A chill went through the night, but he called to mind Emily's radiant face and went happily to sleep. Outside Palamon's tent, a squire was sharpening his master's lance with a knife. The shavings fell onto the canopy and made shadows like a swarm of spiders. A chill went through Palamon, but he thought of Emily and how pleased she would be by his chivalrous heroism, and he went to sleep contented. The joust was a circus of color. Knights, caparisoned in mail, heraldic surcoats, and plumes fit for birds of paradise were brazed by the blaring of trumpets, whose scarlet oriflammes were embroidered with silvery beasts. Blade by blade, the grass was turfed out in divots by the flying hoofs of horses. The pavilions flapped like Chinese kites. By midday, the ladies tripping back and forth to their seats had scarlet hems where their gowns had swept the field. In the hottest part of the day, Arcite and Palamon found themselves at opposite ends of the jousting fence. Palamon's lance weighed heavy in the crook of his arm after so many months in prison. The squires blew a shrill fanfare. The horses rattled the bits between their teeth and pranced towards one another. On the first pass, both lances missed their mark, and the two cousins passed, shoulder to shoulder, grimacing into one another's face. On the second pass, Palamon saw the point of Arcite's lance bearing squarely for his chest. He flung himself forward along his horse's neck, dropping his own lance. But the oncoming lance tip tore through the back of his tunic, caught in his belt, and lifted him out of the saddle, pitching him to the ground. Arcite's lance was dragged from his grip, but he turned at the head of the lists and came galloping back down the field, swinging his mace. His iron spikes bruised the air with each whistling circle the mace head made on its chain stalk. Palamon, his head uncovered, fell to his knees, but he knew he could not escape the swinging iron. In the grass, his hands brushed the lance that had dragged him from his horse. His fingers closed round its haft, and he was lifting it to protect himself, when Arcite, stretching from his saddle to strike the mortal blow, rode straight on to its point. His face cleared of all expression. His horse rode from under him, and he stood for a moment with the lance planted in his chest. The mace dropped from his hand, and he spread his fingers across the red of his surcoat. "Cousin," he said, then fell dead on his back, the lance rising like a mast out of his hull. Palamon took off his gauntlets and crawled across the grass to Arcite's side. "Friend," he said, touching his cousin's cheek, "what have we done?" Then the crowds were upon him, praising, congratulating. Duke Theseus was there, and Emily too, though Palamon could not recognize her at first among the other women. They were all quite pretty. Theseus began, "Arcite, my boy." "Palamon. I'm Palamon." "Oh, well, Palamon, my boy, let this be an end to all quarreling. Your rival has died a glorious death in the name of chivalry, and you have fought bravely too. Take Emily's hand and forget every unhappiness. The wedding shall be tomorrow." Hanging back in the shadow of her brother-in-law, Emily said, "Ugh, do I have to? His hair is awfully thin already, and I don't like his mouth." She had a voice like the teeth of a comb clicking. "Nonsense, Emily. He's a very chivalrous knight, even if he is a foreigner. Emily, Arcite, my blessing on you both." "Palamon. I'm Palamon," said the chivalrous knight, while at his feet Arcite raised no argument whatsoever. The knight stopped speaking. The woman in the enormous hat, who I learned was a widow all the way from Bath, had been leaning out of her saddle to catch the knight's words. She was rather deaf, I think. She continued leaning towards him, waiting for more. "Well," she demanded, in a huge West Country voice, "were they happy?" The knight shook himself. "Yes, oh yes, they both lived happily ever after. Palamon woke to each day happier than the day before." The widow smiled and sat back into her saddle with a thump. "I don't know if he would, under the circumstances," I said. "Under these circumstances," said the knight, waving a hand towards the listening pilgrims. "We had to have a happy ending. Now, who's next?" "All the same," said a pebble-headed reeve snarlingly, "it wasn't a whole heap of laughs, your story." The knight freely admitted it. "I'm afraid I couldn't think of a funny story offhand." "Well, I can," said the reeve. We seemed to be about to hear his story, whether we liked it or not.
And before we get into the Reeve story, there's still just a little bit more of this. So, who asked you? Red as firebrand, the miller's hair and beard showed through the mist like beacons, with flaring black nostrils housed in a red tufted nose. The miller rampaged down on us like a wild boar. The Reeve's fingers closed round the handle of the carpenter's mallet, but he did not pull it from his saddlebag. "Drunk already, Matt," he said, blipping the miller's horse on the nose with his reins as it cannoned into him. "What if I am you, woodpecker?" retorted the miller. "Isn't it bad enough to be traipsing through the fog and rain and up to our noses in mud?" "Best place for your nose," muttered the Reeve. "Isn't it bad enough without having to listen to a chiseling carpenter?" "Hey, hey, what is this between you?" said Harry. "Have you two brought some old grudge along with you?" Oswald the Reeve did not so much answer as growl in the general direction of Matt. "Just because I do him a favor, knock him up a lean-to for his mill, and at a price he wouldn't get for any carpenter in the south of England, these are the thanks I get. The wood was so rotten it fell in my hand on my head the first time I so much as touched it. At the price you paid, what do you expect? Mahogany?" "Oh, there," Harry protested. "Let's have a story, not a war." But the Reeve was sulking by this time, and perhaps he rode off to the back of the line to be a safe distance from the miller's swinging fists. I swear, Arcite's iron mace swinging down on Palamon's head couldn't have done more damage than those fists on the end of those arms. The moment the reeve was out of sound and sight, Matt the miller cheered up hugely. He got out his bagpipes and struck up a tune, so hideously strident, so tunelessly discordant that we begged him to stop and tell us a story instead. I hoped you might say that, he said, and the drone of his pipes died away like an expiring sheep. Down at Osney Mead in Oxford, the scholar, an Oxford man himself, looked up from the book he was reading. I'm acquainted with that, he said. What? Snarled the miller. You mean you've heard my story before? No, I simply observed that I know Osney Mead. Ah, that's all right then. No more butting in, no, right? The scholar gave a bewildered shrug and went back to his book. The miller glared around at us, then his ruined face collapsed into a grin that showed all his tombstone teeth. I have to admit, I'm a bit tipsy. I can tell from the way my words are coming out. If you have any trouble following, just shout, and ladies, if I give offense, blame it on the drink. I'm not sure I ought to relay the story with which Matt the Miller regaled us. It wasn't, shall I say, it wasn't the kind of story you hear in church or recount to your mother when you get home. Still, it fetched a lot of laughter from some of the pilgrims, so I had best not keep it from you. If you find it a little rude, you'd better cover your eyes while you read. The Miller's Tale, a Barrel of Laughs. And we'll get back to that one later. Great work, everybody.